The current trend in public-private partnerships, P3s, is that these projects do tend to be quite large. I know that in Kiewit Development Company in Kiewit, there may be out of 9 bids that we're actively bidding at the moment, 2 of them are less than $1 billion. Everything else is between $1 and almost $3 billion. They're massive projects. The other point of my questioning relates to the fact that in these deals, we're typically partnered at the construction level with at least one other partner, a construction joint venture, in a design-build environment within the context of a P3. So you'll see that there is some familiarity or similarity between design-build and P3s, and we'll see that as I go through my material. Infrastructure deficit. This to me is, and I've referred to this in the past as a classic Harvard business case. What kind of a business case would you design that really makes a perfect business model for constructors, investors, and designers? And I summarize it with 3 points. The infrastructure is getting older and it's deficient. Nobody wants their taxes raised, and governments are running out of money. Those are 3 sound fundamentals that you would want to have to build a P3 business as an investor, a constructor, or a designer. It's a great business model, and it's really one of the fundamentals. Now, the interesting thing is, in particular related to transit, and airports to a certain extent are the same, these authorities, whether they're airport or transit, have got plans for expansion that have been sitting on the shelves for, in some cases, decades. And I think what's happening is that as these agencies see that P3s are a method of procurement that involves the private sector equity and debt, they're saying, hey, we can actually do these deals now. We can supply the transit infrastructure that otherwise we couldn't because we didn't have the money. So I think just in terms of trends, I think we'll see more transit transactions coming up in the next 5 years. I think it's going to be massive. I think that the key thing to point out is that P3s are not the panacea. They're not the solution to all infrastructure deficit situations. It's one of the methods, but we've got other great methods of delivering the infrastructure that again, we've all had the experience in, from design build to sole source. But generally in the case of a public-private partnership transaction, there's a business case. There's been some sort of analysis that a DOT, for example, has retained advisors to take a look at a business case to show how getting private equity involved and debt could help to supply the infrastructure. So it's trusting and collaborative, normally in terms that you wouldn't find used in a typical delivery model. And it truly depends on, this is overworked, but it truly depends on a paradigm shift. It's a different way of thinking, and one of the keys as it relates to how change happens is it has to start at the top. So you need political support. If it's at the state level, at the governor's office, and then it has to flow down through to the DOTs, for example, or departments of justice, or wherever else within the hierarchy of a state government that you can start building the support for it, and then it has to flow down and out into the broader range of staff on the public sector side. But top level support is absolutely the key. A few years ago, when we were looking at potential transactions, political support was the top criteria that we needed to see in place in order for us to pursue a transaction. It was when I was at Billfinger. Okay, so what is a P3? I've defined it a little bit, and you may hear later on today in 1 or 2 of the groups their definition of it, but it's the public sector, the private sector working in partnership using a certain amount of government money, for example, through the TIFIA program, and private activity bonds, but also with private equity and debt, working together to produce assets and infrastructure for the public. It generally includes an operations and maintenance component, it's a finance component, and design build component, and all of these are working together to produce a transaction that at the end of the day hopefully ends up in a great asset for the public. I'll just talk a little bit about the actual structure of a transaction just to give you an idea of where you might fit in or where others might fit in the context of a public-private partnership. So you've got a public owner, which could be a DOT, it could be in the case of the courthouse, for example, here, Department of Justice, it could be the public owner. You've got the private owner, which is the group that supplies the equity into the transaction. You've got debt, which is in the form of bonds, for example, would be one, or a combination of bonds and bank debt. These groups form a concessionaire special purpose entity. That's what SPE stands for. And they staff this concessionaire. This is kind of the developer in a transaction. And contractually and legally, the contracts, and I'll show you a slide in a minute that explains this, are between the public owner and the concessionaire. And the concessionaire has, if you like, a subcontract to the design-build subcontractor, a tolling subcontractor if it's a toll project, and an operations and maintenance subcontractor or a facility manager if it's a hospital or a school or a courthouse. So that's kind of an overview of the structure. That's how it works. If you're a contractor and you want to be in a public-private partnership, you're generally dealing with partners that are in the upper echelon in terms of quality and experience, and you know, your teammates are the best of the best usually, is like how I would refer to it. And so if you're going to play in that game, it requires the dedication to assign resources to that kind of a deal for, you know, 6, 10, 12 months, maybe even more than that. So it does take a time commitment. I think they're rewarding, but that is something that you need to be aware of if you're thinking of going into it. You're kind of playing in the big leagues in terms of experience of the people that you're working with. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. The life cycle of a P3 is something that we need to talk about because they don't happen in 6 months. It's a process that, not including the RFI stage, which that doesn't take a lot of time usually. But at the RFQ stage, once you're submitting in response to a request for proposals, it's a very time-consuming and intense period. And so going from there to the point where you can actually start constructing is typically 18 months to 20 months. It's in that range, sometimes less, sometimes more. But that's the kind of time frame that these things take to get from an idea at the RFP stage to actually shovels in the ground. You're in then to the course of construction, again, dictated to a certain extent by the size of the deal. You know, $1 billion, $2 billion, 3 to 5 years typically is kind of the lifespan of construction. Then the concessions normally have 25 to 35 years of operations that are also the responsibility of the private sector. What it really all boils down to, and there are a number of factors that are important, but the method generally of selecting the winner in an RFP process is the lowest net present value. Net present value is a financial calculation that uses the time value of money to discount a flow of expenses, bringing it back to today's dollar. There's a formula. It's on my calculator. I don't know how it works. The bottom line is that notwithstanding there's operations and maintenance is part of a deal, the special purpose company and the rehabilitation budget is part of a deal, the financing is part of a deal, but what wins the transaction is the construction price. That is really the key. And one of the responsibilities of the concessionaire is to make sure that there's a clear interface between the constructor, the designers, and the operator to optimize all parts of the transaction. But again, that's at the heart of it. Now, there have been 1 or 2 transactions in the last year where the construction price has been so close, and I mean within less than 1%, that some of these other factors do make the difference. I guess the point is, you can't assume that you can be cavalier about any parts of a deal. Everything has to be sharp and optimized, but construction price is the king. So that's a key aspect of a transaction. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of some of the different types of delivery. You're probably familiar with some of these, but there's quite a list. I won't go through them all. Maybe start at the bottom just with the Highway 183 because it's one that we recently won in Texas and is a hybrid. I talked about a couple of the various potential models of P3s. This is a new variant. I think this may be the first of its kind. And what it is it's a design-build project with gap financing, which is basically the private sector, the bidder, covering the gap between what the DOT actually has to pay for the project and what is really going to be required to build the asset. And it's a scheme that's paid out over 5 years by the proponents. But it also includes whereas in a normal design build, you would walk away from it at the end of the construction. This includes 30 years, 25 or 30 years of operations and maintenance. That's kind of the unusual part of this deal. So in this particular transaction, you've got the constructor and the source of debt to cover this. It's $250 million in this case. And then a subcontract with an operations and maintenance company to actually perform the O&M, is what it's called, for that concession period. The initial contract is for 7 years for the O&M, and then the option to renew it or to replace at the end of that 7-year period. So it's a bit of a hybrid. We'll see more of these. There's a project in Nevada that's coming out probably using this model, another one in Texas. I think we'll see more of these. Goethals Bridge, you may or may not be familiar with that in New York. We happen to be involved in that. It's quite a large project. It's over $1 billion. And design, build, finance, and maintain. The full spectrum is design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, whether it's a tolling project, as you would see these are, or design, build, finance, operate, maintain, availability payment mechanism. So, and that can apply to transit as well, incidentally. Maybe just spend a minute on that. The equivalent terminology in a transit project for traffic volume risk is ridership risk. And in the context, and I don't think there are any right now where ridership risk is included, but usually a component of the total payment could be related to the ridership of using the system. So ridership versus traffic volume is the context of a transit project. And you can see I've got some transit projects on here. Ohio River Bridge is a great project, Port of Miami Tunnel, and one other. Just moving on to that. Just moving on quickly to this. Now this is maybe just a little bit of history. I don't know did anybody see the movie The Iron Lady? Margaret Thatcher. She was, and her government, that's where public-private partnerships originated. Because in England, they realized that there's just no way that they could afford to deliver the infrastructure for a growing population. So over the course of several years, they came up with this alternate delivery method. And you know, we all either have her to thank or blame, I guess depending on where you are. But in my case, I'm thanking her. And so it really started in the UK and migrated throughout Europe and Australia. I happened to join Bilfinger Berger at the time when we were opening an office in Australia to pursue P3s as well. So Bilfinger was a large construction company, international company in construction, and owned quite a significant construction operation in Australia. So my colleagues there were bidding and building at the same time on the same deals. And so the concept migrated to Canada, and over the course of probably almost 20 years, in the early days even if you included that, there are over 219 assets that have been delivered, and this includes schools, a lot of hospitals. Of course, the healthcare system in Canada is different there, but a lot of schools, a lot of hospitals. Transit is about to be delivered. Defense projects, a major defense facility in Ottawa has been constructed using the P3 model. But in the $70+ billion range, a lot of assets. It's a proven model. There's some consistency between provinces in terms of the legislation, the procurement methodology, and that type of thing. The opportunity for delivery of infrastructure using the P3 model in the United States is at least 10 times what it is in Canada. I use that 10-to-1 ratio because the population is about a tenth, Canadian population is about the tenth of what it is in the US. It seems to work in just about everything if you give it a little bit of latitude. So the amount of opportunity that exists here in terms of the number of projects, the type of project, the location, is quite frankly, it's staggering. And we're really, really at kind of the front end of what I see as a continuing curve, like the hockey stick going up. I can't underestimate or underemphasize the importance of the proper risk allocation. It's all fine to say, if you're a DOT or any other public agency, that all risks are going to be given to the private sector. Let them pay for it. That is really not the best way to get best value for money. You know, it's either a sharing of risk or retention of certain risks to be held at a DOT, for example, that is the right solution, because nothing comes without a cost. And if for example, one of the big ones that everybody I'm sure maybe has encountered, in tunneling, geotechnology risk is one of the big ones. And there's a range of methods of dealing with that. The private sector takes all the risk. Guess what? It's going to be priced. It's not free. And there are sharing mechanisms where you can share different levels of that risk as you go through the risk chain that are much more efficient and quite frankly, fairer for everybody at the end of the day. So risk sharing and a proper allocation of that risk is critical. Another one I'm sure you all encountered on a fairly regular basis is utilities risk. Dealing with regulated or unregulated utilities and letting the construction folks take the full risk of that is just not economical really when it comes to the end of the day. So there's some sort of a reevaluation of that kind of a risk sharing is absolutely critical in terms of these projects being successful, because nothing, like I said, is free. Let me summarize by saying what I said at the outset. Fundamentally, very sound business model. Governments don't have the money, people don't want taxes raised, and infrastructure is falling apart. I may be overstating that a little bit. I mentioned the deficit. It's clear this is the kind of model that can help produce the assets that we really need to be competitive in a world environment today. And basically that's it. So hopefully you got some questions.